Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Findmypast Live. My name is Ellie. I run social media for Findmypast, and today we have a very special guest with us. We have Dr. Mike Esbester of the University of Portsmouth. Welcome, Mike.
Hi, Ellie. Thanks very much for having me.
It's fantastic to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you guys at home for joining as well. We've been doing these Findmypast at home sessions since March, I think now. So it's really great that you guys can join us. We offer free advice and free help from genealogists and other historians, and you can tune in from your own home. We're at home as well, as you can probably tell. And the great thing is if you can't catch up, if you can't tune in live, you can always catch up at a time that is convenient for you. You can do it on our YouTube page or from the video section of our Facebook page. So that's grand. Now, today with Mike, we are going to be chatting about railways, specifically railway accident reports, and how the stories can just come to life in these reports and other records that you can look at to cross reference. So if you do have a question for Mike, please pop it into the comments. Say hi to Niall as well. He's going to be in the comments manning those today. So yeah, if you have a question, add it in, say hi to us, let us know where you're tuning in from, and we'll crack on, I suppose. So Mike, just to introduce you to Mike as well. So he is a senior lecturer in history for the University of Portsmouth. His research focuses on 19th and 20th century Britain, in particular the cultural history of safety, risk and accident prevention, and also the history of mobility. And he works with the British Safety Council, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents and the railway industry as well. And in the past, he has also worked for the Department of Transport on the history and policy seminar series. Now, have I missed anything, Mike? Is there anything else you want to add to that?
I don't think so. I think that's fairly comprehensive. Thanks. Sorry, one thing. The only thing I'd say is I would like to thank a colleague of mine down at Portsmouth, Deborah Sugg-Ryan, who regular viewers will know has been on in the past, as she put me in touch with you, Ellie, and Niall and others as well. And it's great that we've been able to do this.
Yeah, I'm really excited, and Deborah's lovely. We had Deborah on last week, of course, for our house history panel with Melanie Bagg-Hansen as well. So it's great that we all talk to each other, and you've been able to come on today and talk about your project. But before we get into that, I'm just going to say hello to people. So we've got William, we've got Sue, we've got Ellen. Good morning, Ellen. Lovely day in Roscoe, Illinois, she says. We've got Nicole, Lorraine, Cindy from Texas. We've got Georgia, Patricia, Claire. We've got Julie, we've got Sylvia, we've got Linda as well, we've got Chris Lang, we've got Daphne, Anya, Victoria, lots of you today, fantastic. We've got Roy as well from Rhondda Valley, and Karen, fantastic. Brilliant. Well, we've got lots of you today. So as I said, if you do have a question about railways, the history of railways and the history of reporting accidents on the railways, please add it into the comments and we will get to them a little bit later on. And I suppose I think we do need to preface this session, Mike, because we are going to be talking about railway accident reports. So what we're going to be talking about is going to include some references to injuries and also to death as well. So just in case that is an issue for anybody, we are going to be talking about injuries and death in terms of the railways. But Mike, before we start, myself and a lot of people watching, we're family historians, and I just wondered if you'd done anything on your own family history at all.
I haven't, because my father has. And
there's always somebody in the family, isn't there, who's done it?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's great that he did. If he hadn't, I probably would have done, because with a surname like Esbester, it's fairly unusual. In fact, it is unique. There are only 15 of us in the world. So we traced it back. It's a spelling mistake. An ancestor went into the Navy in mainland Scotland in the Napoleonic Wars as John Esbester from the town on the Shetland Isles, Esbester, and came out of the Navy in Plymouth as John Esbester. So and from that we've all stemmed. So it's a nice little story.
I love that. Actually, my surname Overthrow, that's quite unusual as well. You don't get many Overthrows around, and you definitely don't get many Overthrow Joneses. I think that is quite unique, actually. So yeah, we'll just say hello to a couple more people before we get started. So we've got Nikki, we've got Victoria. She likes my sparkly headband that I stole off my sister, but we won't talk about that. Let's have a look. Fiona's saying she's having trouble with the presentation and an iPad. The link isn't working properly. Maybe somebody can help you in the comments there. Niall should be in as well, so maybe he can offer some advice. We've got Rosie as well. We've got Pam. We've got Angela from Utah. And we've got a couple of questions coming in as well. Yeah, just add in your questions and we'll get to those before we finish up. So I think we should get cracking, Mike. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is, why do you think the railways and the history of railways, why do you think they're so poignant for us? Because there's just something about railways, isn't there? I mean, we've got, you know, heritage railways nowadays, and, you know, those are a great day out. What is it about them?
Yeah, great question, and it's really important. I think really important to what we're doing with the project as well. Partly it's about the kind of the national story. I think that the Industrial Revolution and the railways playing a key part in that. You know, there's large elements of myth in that, and we'll come back to some of that perhaps. But it's important, kind of these stories of great firsts that we like to think about that are important. The dramatic impact that the railways had over the years on pretty much every walk of life, regardless of the occupational side, but the social side of the United Kingdom, of the entire world, in fact. Plus, I think for some people there's a nostalgic element to it. Those who can remember steam, in particular. Although, again, thinking about, you mentioned the heritage side of things and the steam railways and so on, you know, they do a fantastic job, and I'd definitely say go out and support them at the moment, particularly when you can get to them, given what's going on and the impact that COVID's had on all sorts of heritage and cultural attractions. But they're translating this kind of enthusiasm and interest from people who might perhaps remember steam to those of us who can't remember steam, and it's still a great day out.
Absolutely. And as that leads me nicely onto my next question, which was about context. So some of us might have ancestors who worked on the railways in times gone by. And what do you think we need to bear in mind when researching them? Are there particular pieces of contextual information that are important for us to remember?
I think it's a case of seeing this in that bigger picture. As you say, the context is so important. So not just about the railways, but the nature, if we think particularly of the 19th century, of industrial work, which we might perhaps view it with rose-tinted spectacles. Certainly in terms of the railways, you know, the steam engines, the glamour, the romance, particularly the engine driver. Whereas the reality for many people, many of the workers certainly, was really not that great. It was a hard job. It undoubtedly had definite benefits to it. It could be a job for life. It could be relatively well paid. It could be a ticket to mobility, so moving around both for the job and socially for the passengers. So thinking about this bigger picture, where the railways fit within both society and on the occupational side, that this is one of a number of in the 19th century new occupations, new roles, new industries that crop up that offer people opportunities that they perhaps didn't have before. So the general picture is really important. When you start to then drill down into the railway specific side of things, that's one where kind of really understanding what the job entailed is important.
And I suppose there are a variety of different jobs as well, from, you know, very labour intensive to working on the trains themselves, like we might imagine today. And when we've been looking at the research for today, there have been some occupations that I've not come across before. So I think I'll ask you about those as we move through the research. But in particular, the railways they're not ever present at all, because it's only a 200-year-old invention. But in my hometown, for example, I think the railway station there was opened in 1848, I want to say. And also there are, going around my local area, there are so many railway stations that are no longer there. And you look at old pictures, and you can almost hold the picture up to where you're looking at, and it once held a railway station or a railway line. There are walkways that you can now walk along, I suppose. Yeah. And they're just old railway lines, and they're some of my favorite places to walk.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Again, the kind of the physical legacy of these things. When they're being built, they're incredibly disruptive. People in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s are really concerned about the impact on the environment, the scars that were being cut across the countryside in many cases. And they were a real challenge to what was seen as the status quo, so this really modern thing at the time. Obviously, it then kind of grew into itself and settled into an environment and became a part of just everyday life. And then we get to the point where, when stations are closed, when lines are closed, you get the remnants. Some of these things are incredibly difficult to dispose of. You have huge embankments, big cuttings, the tunnels, and so on. So well, they stay. And so they're still around us, still a part of us, still very, very visible reminders of what happened in some cases. So yeah, I think all of that kind of contributes to this the relationship we have with railways, certainly in the UK.
And you've got a particular relationship with railways, and I think now might be the perfect time to discuss the banner that's just behind you. So, what are you working on at the moment? What's the project about?
So, I've had a long-standing interest in railways and railway history. But whilst I was doing some research, I came across an image which I'd like to share, if I may. So I'll just pull this up. Or not, as the case may be, as I can't find it. It was open. I don't know where it's disappeared. Anyway, it is a posed image, an accident prevention image of a worker about to be run down by a train. And it looks ludicrous, which is really why I wanted to show it. To the eye, you just think, well, why would anyone need this? But when you start to dig around into it, it's like, well, why hasn't this been done before? What's going on here? What's the story behind it? Why is this necessary? And that started me off really looking at the subject of accidents to railway workers. And it was incredibly revealing, again, about what society valued and values about lives. For much of the 19th century and indeed much of the 20th century, railway workers' lives were frankly quite cheap. Very often from the working classes, relatively little political voice, and also these sorts of accidents were quite invisible. They weren't the big passenger crashes and accidents that made front page news. They were small stories, if mentioned at all. So there's this real kind of sense of, well, this is an industry killing and injuring loads of people. Why don't we know more about it? And why wasn't something being done about it, or what was being done about it? So digging around in that, the people really have become central to that, because the kind of headline statistics are quite brutal. So in 1913, there were around 600,000 people employed in the industry, of whom about 30,000 had an accident. About 500 deaths, which is still an incredibly high number, and the rest injuries, but 30,000 people in a single year. Those numbers are almost too big to grasp. But it's when you start to kind of drill down and look at the people, the individuals involved, that you get some sense of it. So just as an example of that, there's just a little montage here of a few of the people who were killed at work in a 4.5-year period on one railway company. Across this period, we're looking at thousands of deaths. So this is a tiny sample, but you actually get to see some of the people, and I think that's really important. And it's really what's behind the Railway Work, Life and Death project, is thinking less about those big numbers and more about the individuals involved.
Because they are all, there's people behind all of these reports. And I suppose the reports are sort of the centre of the Railway Work, Life and Death project, but they're not the be all and end all. It's these actual people who were affected by their work on the railways.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's it. The reports that we're drawing on in the project are, at the moment at least, are those that were generated by kind of the official side of the industry. So they're tremendously revealing, and we'll talk about that. But they were produced by the railway companies, by the trade union, the major trade union that was for many of the railway workers, and by the state. So the state had a number of inspectors who investigated worker accidents after they'd happened. And that's great. It's really important. It tells us an awful lot, but from a very top-down point of view. And what we'd really like to do in a project is to get to grips with the individuals, the bottom-up side of things, a bit more than we have done already, although we've had some success in that.
Absolutely. And I think you had a couple of questions for our lovely audience, didn't you?
Yes, yeah, thanks, Ellie. I wanted just to ask people, and I think people have probably been sharing this already, I hope anyway, but whether any of the viewers had any railway ancestors in their background, and if they did, if they knew whether they'd had any accidents at work. As you said at the beginning, you know, it's a really tricky subject in some ways, because obviously these are real people and they had families, friends, they belong to communities, and seeing sometimes, or finding out a bit about what happened to them is, you know, it's not great news, but it's really important to know that and not to gloss over these difficult bits of the past, and to get to grips with it. So to kind of move away from those rose-tinted spectacles view as the glamour of steam, and get to grips with the dirt and the grime a bit more. So yeah, I wondered whether people had any accidents in their railway pasts, and also if anyone had already used our project resources, because we'd love to find out about that, either for general context. What we're doing does give this background, and you understand a bit more about what people are doing on the railways, even if it's not your exact ancestor, or even if you found one of your ancestors in the material that we've been making available so far. What I will say is it's been really great so far is when we've had those contacts from people, they got in touch, say, oh yes, I found my grandfather or my great grandfather in your records, and it filled in a blank in our family history. We now know what happened, and that's really brilliant. You know, thinking about that context, it kind of brings it home, and it's been wonderful how much people have been, how generous people have been, and how willing they've been to share with that. And a quick kind of thanks to you all at Findmypast, I will say, is that the blog post that we put up last week about the project, off the back of that, we've had people getting in touch, offering us more details, in some cases photos of their railway ancestors who've had an accident. A nice contact recently from Helen Pearson, who said, oh, she'd researched under lockdown, she'd researched her railway ancestors and produced a little booklet, so she's going to send me a copy because a couple of them had accidents. You know, people are brilliant like that. It's wonderful.
That is lovely. And you all at home, you know, you're exactly the same. You're always so willing to help out and to volunteer your expertise, and we're always very grateful for that. It's lovely. And Mike, we've had a couple of comments in about railway ancestors and accidents, so I'll just read a couple out. Just missed one, it's just disappeared, which is a little bit frustrating. We've got Sylvia, who says, I've shared with Mike that my research has identified how the railways contributed to the ability of anti-vaxxers to travel around Scotland to promote the cause to lobby against compulsory smallpox vaccination.
Yes, hi Sylvia, lovely to hear from you on here. Yeah, thanks very much for that. Absolutely, yeah. That's again that wide impact of the railways in all sorts of sometimes really unexpected ways. But yeah, lovely to hear from you.
Yeah, Sylvia is a regular of these live sessions, and her expertise is always very welcome. And we've got Leslie, who says, we are a railway family. My granddad, my uncles, cousin and me all worked in London. That's amazing that it's just the occupation just carry on through your family, Leslie. A couple of questions there, which I'll save for later. Let's scroll back down. Lorraine saying, my great grandfather was a locomotive driver on the Great Western Railways. Any more that I can pick out here? Royston, on the railways, what is a plate layer? That's what my great grandfather was.
Okay. So plate layer is someone that would have been at that time men only, because because again, it was deemed a man's job, very physical, hard work of maintaining the tracks. So they'd typically work in gangs. It could be just a couple of men, it could be as many as 30, to keep the track in running order, to do any relaying work that needed doing. This is pre-machine, so everything had to be physically shifted by people. So yeah, really hard work, and actually really dangerous work as well. I think we may come on to it later, but if for some roles, and I should have said this on the railway, the railways are so vast, they've got so many different roles and jobs within them, and as you said, some very interesting job titles, but they weren't just confined to the railways and running the railways. People think of the engine drivers, perhaps the people, the shunters, the people who get the goods trains ready to go, they get the trucks in the right order and so on. But it's so much more varied than that. The railways had great interest in shipping, they owned docks, they ran road services, particularly horse and cart, but also when motor comes in as well, bus services, and in the 1930s they expand into air traffic as well. So they'd run hotels, all sorts of things. And of course you need people to keep these things going. They make everything pretty much themselves, be it from the smallest thing, the pencils, right up to the engines. So there's all sorts of things where you need people to do stuff, and that means that lots of them are there's different levels of risk attached to it. Relatively speaking, the dangers to which someone, a clerk in an office, is exposed are relatively minimal compared to someone like a plate layer, Royston mentioned, where if it's sad, but if something goes wrong, these are groups of men working on the tracks, they're run into by a train, you do tend to see 5 or 6 being killed sometimes, 2s and 3s. So it's often very bad when something bad happens. So fingers crossed, in Royston's case, nothing did happen. It was great grandfather's case.
Yeah, we've got a comment from Georgia here as well, who says, my grandfather was a chef on the Great Eastern Railway, Liverpool Street to King's Lynn line. He had an accident with the oven on the train and injured his hands. Not too serious, thankfully. They were just burned, but still an accident. I can imagine that they would have taken a while to heal as well. Yeah,
that's really nice. And one of the great things about what we've been doing with the project and making these accident reports and information more easily available is that you can trace changes over time and occupational changes. So you can see the use of electricity on the railways coming in terms of as a motive power. So you suddenly start getting, in the early 1900s, rather more burns cases where people have touched live wires. And I saw some today in the 1930s where you start getting acetylene related accidents, because they're using new forms to kind of do their jobs, for welding, cutting and so on. But yeah, that's a great example, of the sorts of different roles that workers had that you wouldn't necessarily immediately think of, but the railways needed staff to do fairly much everything.
Yeah, and just as a quick side note before I move on to some more comments, I really quite like watching programs on TV about old hotels, and it's amazing how many of these old hotels are linked to the railway and to the development of the railways. But that's just a little side note from me. So comment from Eric, my 4 times great grandfather was Charles E. Tilton, owned and operated a few short lines in New England. And Jackie, my great great uncle, worked on the railway in Craig, Scotland. My mum knew him as Uncle Sandy. I only found him because the Scots put his wife's maiden name on many documents, and that was and she had that as the family name. Yeah, Scottish name and traditions coming back there for you. Those are good. We should do a whole other session on those. Anyway, right, any more have I got here? Linda says, good afternoon from Darlington. Both my granddad and my great grandfather worked on the railways. Granddad was a signalman, and then I'm not sure what my great grandfather did. Well, hopefully you can find out at some point, Linda. June saying, my grandfather worked on the railroad in the Elliot Main area. Gosh, lots of you with connections to the railway. This is excellent. Mary saying, I had a great uncle that worked on the railway here. He was a brakeman and was caught between 2 cars and killed in 1946. Goodness.
So if I can jump in on that one, that's is sadly not uncommon. I think from the terms used, a viewer in the States probably. That's really interesting because they were an early adopter in the 1890s of automatic coupling, so technology which meant that the workers shouldn't have to go between the freight cars, the wagons, to join them together. Whereas in the UK, the railway companies really resisted it because it's going to be really expensive to introduce, which meant that workers still had to go between the wagons to couple and uncouple them. So again, it's really interesting about these international differences, as well as sadly, that's a really common form of accident. And again, it's generally quite nasty when it happens.
Yeah, we've got another one here from Jean. My grandfather worked on the railroad in England and subsequently Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where he was killed by a reversing engine. So sad. Very sad. Right, I've got lots to read through, but I am very conscious of time. The last thing I wanted to say in regards to our personal connections to the railways is actually my 3 times great grandfather, William Smith, was actually a railway inspector in the Midlands. And normally somebody like William Smith is very, very difficult to track down, but it's been helpful because he was actually born in Scotland, and you can sort of trace his railway career on the census records. So on the 1881 census, he's down as a railway agent carman, and then 1891 an agent Midland Railway, and then by the 1901 census he was a railway inspector. So there we go. No idea if he was involved in any incidents, injuries or anything like that, though.
Hopefully not.
So if you do have any more comments, any more questions for Mike, please keep them coming into the comments. We're going to move on to stories from the records now. Actually, last before we move on, no, never mind, we'll move on to stories from records. So before we went live, Mike kindly sent me over a list of some instances from the records that he has come across, so injuries and also fatalities. And what I thought might be interesting is if we cross-reference those with our newspapers, because newspapers are one of my favorite historical record types and you can glean so much information from them. So I think we'll start off with the Gardiner Watt incident. Mike, do you maybe want to preface us on what happened in this particular incident?
Yeah, thanks, Ellie. This is a really interesting one. This is one that came up. We ran across it because there was an official accident investigation, so it's left a record which we've made through the project more easily available for people. And again, I mentioned that these are the kind of formal documents, so it tells us in fairly neutral terms what happened. And that was that at Sawton, which is now a suburb of Edinburgh, but at the time was much further out as a railway junction there. On the 9th of July in 1913, 2 staff, so Robert Watt, the foreman carriage cleaner, so he was in charge, and Wilhelmina were waiting to cross the railway lines to the investigator thought to get to the stores on the other side. And they knew a train was coming. They stepped back and waited. But just at the last minute, for some reason, Wilhelmina Gardiner stepped back into the path of the train. Watt saw it about to happen, so he tried to pull her back. Unfortunately, both were hit by the train and died. So again, it's a sad case. What's interesting, again, the railway company concerned afterwards did put up some stores on both sides of the tracks to stop this being necessary to cross the tracks again. It's quite this is a good one in some respects because it says a lot about the expected roles of men and women. So we've got Robert Watts as the man in charge, Wilhelmina Gardiner, the woman who was very much under his care, the role that he played in trying to save her, and the roles that women were expected to play on the railway. So it's very much in a traditional, what was understood as an appropriate role for women at the time as a cleaner. And I think it's left some interesting material in the press side of things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, when you passed this over to me, I found lots of instances of this particular report in the newspapers, and I just wanted to share a couple with you. So I did find it in the Dundee Evening Telegraph, I found it in the Scotsman, I found it in the Western Gazette, and I found it in the Dundee Courier. But the really interesting one was actually in the Illustrated Police News. So this incident that took place, all the way up in Edinburgh, made the Illustrated Police News. So I'm just going to try and share my screen, and I'll just show you what this looks like. Okay, share. Okay, you should be able to see that now. So this is the snippet from the Illustrated Police News that talks about the Gardiner Watt accident. And if you've used the Illustrated Police News before for your research, or you've come across it, you'll know that it liked to, draw out these, whether they were crimes or whether they're accidents. And they were quite sensationalist, this newspaper was. So I always do say, take this particular title with a pinch of salt when you're using it for your research. But this image is very, very striking and very dramatic. And I'll just read you briefly the additional copy. So it says, an act of conspicuous bravery illumined a railway tragedy at Sawton Station near Edinburgh, where a railwayman lost his life in a vain effort to save a woman from being cut down by a train. A fast passenger train from Dundee swung round a sharp bend, which the trains from the north take before passing through Sawton Station. Almost simultaneously, a woman named Mrs. Gardiner of 9 Heriot Mount, Edinburgh, was crossing the line about 200 yards distant from the oncoming express. The driver blew his whistle, but it was impossible for him to draw up in time to save the woman. Standing on the other side of the rails, Robert Watt, a foreman carriage cleaner, saw the woman's peril and dashed across the line to save her. His effort was just too late, and they were both struck. Death in both cases was practically instantaneous. And I just think this is so sad, because he's obviously gone to try and save her, and he's just been that little bit too late, and unfortunately they both lost their lives.
What's quite interesting again about the way that this is reported in this case is, again, it's just like Mrs. Watt Mrs. Gardiner has just walked across the line as if she had no reason to be there. It's not mentioned that she was also an employee. And there's a certain amount of artistic license taken both in the illustration and in that description. You're saying that they're on opposite sides of the tracks and he's rushing across to save her. That's not what the accident report says. So again, this is really one of the valuable things I think about what the project is doing, is that we can cross-reference it with other sources and we can start to get a bit more of an understanding of what really might have happened.
Yeah, we even get, we get where she lives and things like that, but we don't quite get, as you said, that she was an employee as well. And yeah, I think it's always very striking how particularly newspapers report on certain instances like this. And it's as I said, I just find the image so striking. It's the only one I came across that has an image like this, because of course it is an illustrated title. So yeah, that's that one. The next one I had a look at, there was one that you sent over, Mike, that I found really, really, really difficult to read almost, because this was a 14-year-old called James McGreevy. And although I didn't find anything in the newspapers for him, I thought it might be interesting for our viewers to hear from you some specifics of this case.
Yeah, so this is one of the interesting things about what the project is doing, is that although we're thinking about railway staff, not all of the people who appear in the database that we've made available are actually railway staff. And James McGreevy is a case in point. He was employed to move by a private company to move railway wagons from their siding in Sandhills in Liverpool into the company's property. And he was using horses to move the wagons, which is quite a task for a 14-year-old, particularly as it was across a public road and up a very steep incline as well. And whilst he was doing that, he'd only been at work a very short time, he stumbled and fell underneath the wagons and died, unfortunately. In this case, I don't know quite what happened to him. Because he's not an employee, it doesn't tell us, which is really annoying and somewhat unfair. But again, that sort of thing is often leads to death or loss of legs, unfortunately. So it's a reach again, but 14, potentially life-changing injuries, assuming he survived. And he certainly wasn't the only younger case that we've got in the data. And the cases that we've seen, really tragically, we just had a whole load more data coming in, a load more cases coming in from I should have said, of course, is thank you to our volunteers who've done all the hard work in making this material available. It's far too many cases for any one person to do it. So we've a team of volunteers, small teams of volunteers at our partner institutions, the National Railway Museum in York and Modern Record Centre at the University of Warwick, and we're also working with a team at the National Archives in Kew to make these records available. But we've just had some more data, more cases in from the National Railway Museum's team, and in that there's a couple of cases of 7 and 8 year olds who weren't employed on the railways, but their fathers were, or they had a reason to be around the railways, who've been injured or killed. You think this is terrible, so young. And conversely, we get a sense of the other age at the end of the spectrum as well. We've got we've got some cases of workers in their 70s and even into their 80s that are coming through and in the database. The most recent case we got was of Alexander MacDonald, who was an 88-year-old plate layer. So again, another plate layer. So again, really hard work. He was out with a colleague clearing snow from some points in Glasgow in 1901 when he stepped in front of a train. He was knocked down. Fortunately, though, he only, again, this is in inverted commas, only broke his left leg. But again, this kind of incredible distance between 7 and 8 year olds at one end and people in their late 80s still at work at the other. So there's a huge variety of material, huge variety of accidents and detail that the project's making available to everybody to use.
Yeah, it's unfathomable, I suppose, when you've got these really young people and also the really old as well. And there was another young one I found. There was a James Beck, and he was either 15 or 16. I think the records seem to differ. But I'll just flick over to this one for you. So this is from the Aberdeen Evening Express, and it reads, "A distressing incident which had a fatal termination occurred on Friday near the Polmaddy," I might be pronouncing that wrong, my apologies, "engine sheds, Glasgow, of the Caledonian Railway Company. A wagon greaser," that's another occupation we may need a definition for, "named James Beck, age 16, who had only recently started work in the employment of the company, failed to observe the approach of a train, the engine of which knocked him down. He sustained serious injuries to his head and his body and was conveyed in an ambulance wagon to Victoria Infirmary, where he succumbed only a few hours after admission." That's just another one, 15 or 16 years old.
Yeah, these are almost everyday occurrences. Certainly the accidents are, but even at the younger age of the range of this age spectrum. What's quite interesting about this one is that, as the news report says, he'd only recently started work on the railways. The railway investigation, the official state investigation into that accident, concluded that actually the accident was down to Beck for his want of care. And again, it seems very, very harsh. I think it is very harsh that in 95% of cases, the workers are blamed for having the accident, usually through the standard phrase is their own want of caution or their own want of care, which is the one that's used in Beck's case. But the investigator goes on to note that there was want of care on the part of Beck, who I'm assured had specifically been warned to beware of the trains. Well, you try warning a child to beware of something, and they're not going to remember that in that particularly not when they're trying to concentrate on doing their job. Wagon greaser, by the way, at this point, wagons, they were running on axle boxes, axles that were used oil or grease. And one thing that railways obviously didn't want to happen was for them to, because they're constantly turning, the friction to mount up so they catch fire. So you'd have someone who would, when the wagons were stopped or nearly stopped, would quickly inspect to see there's enough oil or grease in them. So that was his role. Can I show you something? Would that be all right? I'm going to try.
Of course, yeah. If I stop sharing, you'll be able to share then.
Thank you. Yeah. What's quite interesting again about the tangibility of these cases is that sometimes we get artifacts or things that really link us back to the people mentioned. So I've got here a copy of a booklet that was issued by the railway company that employed James Beck, the Caledonian Railway Company. So this was issued in 1921. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a picture from that. I think I've figured out how I can get this to work now. And right, here we go. Hopefully you can see this. This picture from the inside of the booklet. I'm not interested in the picture actually down here, although again, these booklets are great because they're highly illustrated. So we get kind of an interesting insight into what the companies think workers should and shouldn't be doing. But I'm interested in this bit at the top, where it says a greaser was walking in the 6 foot. So that's the space, not between the rails themselves, but between two railway tracks or by the side, along with his wagon examiner, someone else, and a driver. Although he stepped clear, the greaser, for some inexplicable reason, stepped on the ends of the sleepers, again, foul of the line, was struck on the back of the head by the engine's buffer beam. That's James Beck's case. So the company then use it as a kind of a learning tool. We might understand it in these days. They don't name him. Some of the booklets and some things they do. In this case, they don't. But it looks like it's his accident. So again, it's really interesting to see how these things have an afterlife and how they go on and continue to shape.
And yet at the time, as we can see from these newspaper reports in particular, as you said, they do seem to be recorded as being the workers or the person who has either been injured or has died. It's their fault. It's not, there might be what's the word I'm looking for? There might be a regulation that's missing, for example, or a safety or something to do with safety that's missing. Absolutely.
And again, it's really interesting that attitude stems from the 19th century and the industrial era. So to talk about that wider context and understanding it, that's really where it comes from. This is not uncommon across most workplaces at this time, as the workers have done something wrong, it's their fault. What that entirely neglects is that there are some things that the workers have no control over. They can't choose how they are supposed to do their work or the time that they have in which to do it. The personal protective equipment that they might or might not be provided with. What's quite interesting about the railway industry is that kind of attitude lingers for a very long time. I'm pleased to say that in the last 20 years or so, I think there's been a real sea change, and that nowadays, if there's an accident, the very last thing that it will be attributed to, certainly by the likes of Network Rail, is the worker's responsibility. They look for the systemic factors that might have made the accident happen, that might have contributed to it, and the things that the workers don't have any control over. So again, it's important that change has happened, but for much of the period that the project is looking at, which is late 1880s through to the Second World War, it's very clearly the workers' fault.
Absolutely. It's very sad that I do have a couple more examples that just highlight this again. I'll just share my screen again because we're going to talk about Joseph Snow. And while I share my screen, would you mind just introducing Joseph's story for me, Mike?
Yeah, sure. What's quite nice about this, or not nice isn't the right word. I mean, it's sad. It's another fatality. He was coming off his shift at about 4:30 in the morning in Temple Mills, which is Stratford, so London, near to where the 2012 Olympics were held, on the Great Eastern Railway, as it was then. This is 1911, February 1911. So it clearly would have been dark. It had been foggy the day before, which had meant he'd worked an extra 2 hours, so he might well have been tired. And there's some discrepancy between what the newspaper says again and what the accident report says, which is quite interesting. So the accident report very clearly thinks that it was Snow's fault, and that Snow just slipped and fell underneath some railway wagons that he was walking past.
And I've just brought up the newspaper article here, and it says an inquest was held on Monday at Church House, Leighton, on Joseph Snow. He was 24, a railway guard employed at GER. Could you just say what GER stands for?
So that's the Great Eastern Railway.
Of course, yes. And it says he was killed on Friday. The evidence showed that deceased had just left duty at Temple Mills goods yard and was walking on a board in a 6-foot way by the side of a goods train when 2 trucks left the metals and caught Snow, who was terribly mutilated. Henry Perfect, a shunter, said he was just going to unhook 2 trucks when he saw the 2 others jump. Thomas Ransom, the engine driver, said he thought the trucks went off as the train was being reversed. He did not think that the trucks would have knocked a man off the board, but the deceased must have slipped at the same time. And a juror had asked, "Can you think of any reason why the truck jumped?" "No, I can't," Ransom had replied. The jury had actually come to the conclusion that the man was killed by the trucks leaving the line, but there was no evidence to show why they did that. And that was from the Chelmsford Chronicle.
Yeah, and again, it's interesting on that one in that the official accident investigation did consider that possibility and dismissed it about the truck leaving the line. And in fact, what's really terrible about it, I think, is that they went on to say, well, maybe they did leave the line, but it was only after Snow had fallen underneath them and been killed. So it was really Snow's fault the train was derailed, which I think is, blaming the victim to a whole nother level.
A little. Right, I think I've got one more, and I picked this one out of your list because his name is Albert Robert Cox, and we actually have Alex, who is my colleague, who sometimes does Fridays Live with us, and he's our PR manager. So I picked this because he obviously shares the same last name. And do you want to just introduce Albert, and then I can read out the accident report from the news?
Yeah, sure. So why I wanted to think about this one was actually this is quite nice because this is Albert's second accident. It's not his first. So he'd had another one at the same location, so Normanton, or Normanton, depending on your point of view, in Yorkshire, in which he fractured his shoulder because he stepped into the path of a goods train. So it was moving at slow speed. Could have been a lot more serious. And that was in 1911. 4 years later, sadly, he appears in the accident reports again, where he is crossing. He knew that there's a movement about to happen. He's crossing what he thinks is a different line, so that where the trucks are moving on a different line. So he's going to walk across this. Unfortunately, he made a mistake, it seems, and he actually crossed the line that the wagons were moving on, and they knocked him down and killed him.
Yeah, as you said, when I looked at the list you sent me, as you said, he had one accident a few years earlier, and he's obviously survived it. And then this second one in the same place, it killed him. And this one is from the Yorkshire Evening Post in 1915, and it says the Leeds coroner held an inquest this afternoon on Albert Robert Cox, a head railway shunter on the Midland Railway, employed at Northampton Station. On Tuesday, Cox was in the act of shunting a wagon at Northampton North Sidings when he was knocked down and run over. His left leg was practically severed from his body, and he died later in the Leeds infirmary from shock. Accidental death was the verdict.
And just the length of that brief mention is, again, really quite telling about the importance to which it was accorded. And this isn't atypical, unfortunately. So the newspapers are brilliant because they really can help us, but like many of the sources that exist, they can be quite brief.
Absolutely. And there's no humanity to this at all, to this particular newspaper article. Some of the others are a little bit longer, but there's very little here, which I think is quite sad. Okay, what we'll do is I'll stop sharing, and what I thought we would do, Mike, is take some questions, if that's all right with you.
Brilliant. Yeah.
So Niall has been kindly sending me a few, so let's have a look. So Carol has said, my ancestor started as a railway servant, then became a signalman, and after 30 years retired as a station inspector, but I cannot find anything about him on his railway records. Do you have any suggestions?
Well, that's tricky. So just a note on that terminology, railway servant, that's a kind of generic term for a railway employee that was used at the time. And again, really telling about the power of the railway companies and the way they viewed their staff, is that their staff weren't employees, they weren't workers, they were servants. So that's kind of quite a generic starting point, but yes, signalman, inspector. it's tricky. The railway companies were really meticulous record keepers. They had to be for all sorts of reasons, some legal, some operational, but the volume of material that they produced was problematic in terms of keeping it. They kept it as companies whilst it was operationally useful. As soon as it was no longer useful, bin it, because it's taking up shelf space. What then survived and was passed on is, a percentage of that, and then what the archive's been able to keep is a smaller percentage still. So I'm not entirely surprised to hear that it's difficult tracking down any railway employment records, unfortunately. Depending on where, the records will either be at the National Archives at Kew, or up up in Scotland in Edinburgh at the National Records there. But again, it's really hit and miss, and I suspect that they'll already have tried those sources and come up with blank, unfortunately. The other thing I'd suggest actually would be trade union membership as well. If the employees were not locomotive crews, so a cleaner, so an engine cleaner, a fireman or a driver, they had a separate union, ASLEF. But if they were other grades of worker, permanent weighman, so plate layer, shunter, goods guard, whatever, they might well have joined the Amalgamated Society of Railway Servants, which went on to become the National Union of Railwaymen, and is now the RMT. And their records are held at the Modern Record Centre at Warwick, and the trade union membership registers, I believe, have been digitised and available through Findmypast.
Fantastic. Yeah, so there we go. So some places to look for you, Carol, but as Mike said, unfortunately, particular railway records may no longer exist, which is quite sad. Isn't that just the problem of a family historian and of historians in general? So another question here, we've got one from Fiona. I heard you mention Scottish accidents. I know my great uncle died aged 11 in a railway accident going to school. I think it was Haymarket Station, Edinburgh. Where would I get the details?
I would say there's a really useful resource. So what we do for the workers and documenting worker accidents, there's another resource which is available for free, like ours, online at Railways Archive. So just throw Railways Archive into whichever search engine you use, it will pop up. They've been, as with us, working with the Office of Rail and Road, so the industry regulators, to scan, and they've been able to make available digitally passenger accident reports. So if it was a passenger crash, so a passenger train crash, then from 1840 they were investigated, every single one of them. If it was another type of accident, so say unfortunately they slipped and fell under the train at the station, then that wouldn't appear in those reports. But with the location and the date, you can do a quick search through the Railways Archive, and you might then be able to get the report, which would give some more detail. So for passenger accidents, that's what I'd recommend.
Great, that's fantastic. Thank you, Mike. We've got another question here from Victoria, and she has asked, I have ancestors who worked on railways that I can't find on the 1911 census. Does one presume that they were working on the trains and therefore weren't registered if away with work, or was there an incentive that took railway men to work abroad at this time, so in 1911?
Well, okay, I'm not going to be able to give a great answer to this one. I'm not sure about that census question. It is odd that they don't appear. It is entirely possible they might have been physically out of the property at the time at which the return was supposed to be filled in. And I don't know what arrangements, if any, were made to take account of that situation. In terms of railway work going overseas, again, it's that there's earlier that mention of the ancestor who started in the UK and then went to Philadelphia, where they sadly had an accident and died. Railway work was tremendously transferable. So you do have the strong connections with South America, for example, through railway workers going overseas to use their expertise there, presumably better pay available and so on. In terms of organised schemes to make that happen, I'm not sure, I have to say, but it's entirely possible.
I was wondering whether with the 1911 census, if they were, because you'd be recorded where you were on that evening, so maybe they were staying at a hotel somewhere else. Say if they were on like one of the Scotland down to London lines, for example, they may have lived in London, but they might have actually been in Scotland when the census was taken, so they may have been recorded in Scotland, for example. That's a possibility. Yeah,
that's interesting. The railway companies did have hostels that they used to put up workers, particularly engine crews, who were travelling distance and ended up, travelling long distance and ended up staying put in one place to bring the train back the next day. But how they would have been dealt with in the census, I don't know. I mean, they must have been counted and included, but yeah, that could well be worth trying.
Yeah, I've got another question here from Heather, who says, what does it mean to be a railway messenger?
So very often a junior role, so a messenger boy, but you would be taking messages from the telegraph wherever it came into the station to wherever it was needed. It might be somewhere out in a goods yard. So again, that's kind of an interesting one, because it's very often it's a clerical role, but actually you do get those workers being exposed to dangers in the goods yards because they have to go across the railway lines to take the message to or fro. So it depends on exactly what's going on, but that might be it.
One more question from Victoria. She says, I found a photo of my great-grandfather and he's wearing a pin in his lapel. Always wondered if this was linked to being a railway employee. Sorry, I keep losing the comment here. Were railway men given pins or badges, especially if they served for a long period of time?
So it depends on, it could have been a war service badge, depends on the time, the period for this. So if it was during the Second World War, possibly the First World War as well, when partway through railway work, partway through the First World War, railway work was a reserved occupation in some grades. So again, typically loco crews, but also people moving the goods and so on, because it was essential to keep the system moving. They were, I believe, given pins to recognise the fact they were war workers. So it might be that. More likely, I'd suspect, was that it was a trade union pin. So again, a recognition that they remember the trade union, so showing their allegiance.
Fantastic. Okay, we've got a question from Jean, who says, would any railway workers go from London to Canada? And a secondary question, where would the port be, she asks.
Okay, so entirely possible that workers would have gone between the UK and Canada, over to Canada. Again, it's about transferring skills, depending on the period and so on. So I'd imagine it would be more likely in the 19th century, but not improbable in the 20th. And that's one of the important things, again, really interesting to see that there's so many international viewers now, that although we focus on the UK and Ireland, and I probably should have said that earlier in the records that we've got, because for much of the period we're looking at, Ireland was of course a part of the United Kingdom. So just because we say, we talk perhaps about England, Scotland, Wales, don't exclude Ireland from the searches, but also, railway ancestors might have come from the UK or Ireland and gone much further afield. So just yesterday, we received an inquiry from someone who's based in Australia, but his grandfather great-grandfather, sorry, had an accident and was killed at work on the railway lines in the UK in the early 1900s. So there's kind of really international relevance to the project and for family historians to use. As to the port, great question. Couldn't say. Could be Southampton, could be Liverpool. Those would be my guesses, but they are informed, but guesses.
Right, we're just coming up to the hour, Mike. So I think what we're probably going to have to do is wrap up. This has been an incredibly informative session. A little bit more somber than the ones we usually have, but rightly so with the subject material, I think. And I hope it's been useful for you all at home. Obviously with Mike's expertise, and I'm sure, Mike, you've enjoyed hearing our audience comments and questions as well.
Very much so. Yeah. If I could just add, thanks to you all for engaging, for listening, to sharing detailed stories. As always the case, that's one of the things that really makes this this project work. And the engagement we've had with family historians and the input has been, we built it in from the beginning, but it's been really, really important and is important. So do continue to get in touch with us. We're always open to guest blog posts on our website. Follow us on Twitter. Please keep in touch with us and make use of the resources. And if you do find an ancestor in the database that we're making available, we reckon there'll be about 70,000 cases that will be available by the time we're finished. We're working on getting another 20 or so thousand ready at the moment for release. If you do find someone in there, an ancestor, please tell us. That really helps us both get to grips with the people, finding out more about them, which is what we really want to do, but also being able to show people, say, well, look, this is why what we're doing is really important. It's engaging with all sorts of people. It's helping people with their research and finding out more about their family pasts. And that's really important to what we're doing. So yeah, once again, thanks to everyone who's contributed, be they volunteers, guest bloggers, you all for listening, and everyone at Findmypast as well for having me on today.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I hope you'll come back and maybe update us in the future as to where the project is going next and any other discoveries that you make as well. To everybody at home, I have shared the website, the Twitter feed, and we've also shared Mike's blog post into the comments. So if you want to go and have a look at those, please feel free. Now, tomorrow, we've got a pre-recorded session from our very own Jen Baldwin. She's going to be back, and she's going to be talking about how to trace your immigrant ancestors. And then on Friday, we've got Miko returning for Friday's Live as well. So lots to enjoy for the rest of the week. Thank you so much to everybody for tuning in and watching. You are the reason we carry on doing these from home live sessions. So it is a pleasure as always. And thank you to Mike. It's been great to chat to you today.
Thank you.
So we'll just say bye to everybody quickly. We've got people saying thanks. So we've got thank you, Sherry. Thanks, Helen. Thanks, Patricia. Thanks, William. Thanks, Angela, Janet, Patricia, Heather saying I want more. We'll have to do another one. Got Anya saying thank you, Lorraine, Virginia, Chris, Pam, Georgia, Patricia. Got Ellen as well, Royston, Victoria, and Linda saying, I've just found my great-grandfather's union stuff on Findmypast. Fantastic. Right, we'll leave it there. Have a lovely evening, everybody, and we'll catch you next time. Take care.